Welcome back to the Chara Project. I'm Heather.
I'm Sarah.
If you're interested at all in learning how to study the book of Jonah, this is the spot for you. We're taking a deep dive into the book of Jonah, learning how to study it chapter by chapter. Along with this episode, you can find an accompanying Bible study on our website on thecharaproject.com, and it will walk you even more in depth on what questions to ask when you read the book. If you haven't already, you should definitely check out our episode 93, which is an overview of how to study the book of Jonah as a whole, talking about its uniqueness and understanding kind of some of the big high-level questions that you will encounter as you study the book of Jonah. But today we're diving deeper, and we're going to be using our Chara Bible Study Guide. This is the guide that we use that teaches us how to study the Bible, and we're going to be applying it to Jonah chapter 1 as we dive in and understand what is going on in the book of Jonah. So why don't we begin?
All right. Let's start with the first 3 verses of Jonah, really. And that's going to help us kind of lay the groundwork for who we're talking about and all that. And we're actually going to highlight some of the history questions out of our Chara Bible Study Guide. And the first one simply being, who was it written about? And how does the text describe them or describe him in this case? And when we're looking and reading in chapter 1, we learn that this is the primary character here is Jonah. And we learn a little bit about him just from the text. We learn that he was a Hebrew, that he worshiped the Lord God. We see that in verse 9. Then actually, we learn a little bit more if we go over to 2 Kings 14:25, and we learn that he was a prophet called by God. So there's just a little bit, that we can gain from Jonah just from the text itself. And then the follow-up question is, what instruction was given from the Lord? What did God call Jonah to do? And what was Jonah's response? And this is where it gets pretty interesting. God tells Jonah right up in the first couple of verses, it says, "Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it." And other translations say, announce my judgment against it or call out against it. And God says, because their evil has come up before me. So Jonah is being sent on a very specific mission to call out Nineveh on their evil and pronounce God's judgment. What a fun task that would have been to do. And so what do we see Jonah do right away? This is repeated several times. He flees from the Lord's presence. He's like, I am not doing that. And
Going in the opposite direction,
yes,
please.
Absolutely. And he flees. That is repeated 3 times that he's trying to flee from God's presence.
Now, we have to remember, we did a podcast on how to study prophecy. It's episode 92. And one of the things we talked about, Sarah, in that spot was the idea that prophets didn't aspire to be a prophet. They they don't usually climb their way to the top as like an earned position, or it wasn't by popularity or anything of that nature. In fact, to do so, in order to be a prophet, you had to follow some strict guidelines and understand that you could be called a false prophet if you weren't falling in line with what God had asked you to do. God hand-selected people, and he called them their prophets to try to deliver these messages to their people. But prophets weren't it's not a glamorous job. Not everybody was like, please pick me, pick me. And Jonah is obviously feeling this. We see this so much when we see the fact that he's actually the first recorded prophet to disobey God and run the opposite direction. He just did not want to do this.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
We can learn a lot about Jonah and a lot from his mistakes
That's
this book.
exactly things not to do.
Yeah. So the next history question that we want to ask here is, where does this narrative take place? And what can you learn about their town and their travel? So God calls Jonah to journey about 500 miles to the northeast of Samaria to Nineveh. And it helps to know a little bit about Nineveh to know, because I think the question is, well, why? Right. Why does Jonah disobey God?
Right.
Why does he try to flee God's presence? Well, if we learn a little bit about Nineveh, that's going to help us understand why. Nineveh is one of the major cities of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were Israel's one of their most feared enemies from the north. And so instead of going to Nineveh, up to the north, Jonah goes the opposite direction, and he's fleeing about 2,500 miles to Tarshish, and he's willing to go quite a long ways, really, to escape this call from God to go to Nineveh.
Right.
And so again, okay, well, what is going on in Nineveh? Who are these people?
Who are
right?
these people that he's
why
fleeing
is this so bad?
Yeah.
Okay, well, again, we can learn quite a bit from the text itself, and what we can see is if we read it throughout Jonah, that Nineveh, well, it's already been said that that they were wicked, right? Their wickedness came up before the Lord. We also learn a little bit later on in chapter 3 that Nineveh was a very large city. It took about 3 days to go through it. And there's in the very, very last verse of Jonah, we learn that there's over 120,000 people there and who are described as not being able to tell apart their right from their left. And also that there's many animals, but not being able to distinguish their right from their left is really a way of saying that they were spiritually and morally immature or uninformed. And so we see that, God having mercy on these people, calling out these people. But that's a little bit about Nineveh.
Now, what's really great here is what Sarah is showing you is that a lot of times when we're studying history, especially when it comes to a specific book in the Bible, we can often find a lot of the history already in the text. And so we're finding a lot about Nineveh, about Jonah, all these different areas just because we're reading the text itself. We can also look at cross-references, which is where I want to pull us for a sec, because if you look at cross-references, it actually tells us a lot about Nineveh as well. In fact, it pointed me to Nahum, which is another prophetic book. It's a couple books away from Jonah. And in Nahum 3, it actually talks about Nineveh, and it says, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without its victims." And it goes on to talk about many casualties and piles of dead. I mean, it just has very rich language to say some pretty negative things about who Nineveh was, what it stood for, very much mirroring what we're hearing from what we already are learning about in Jonah. But this is not a pretty picture.
No, it goes into more detail in Nahum.
It does. It does. Nahum does give us a little bit more of a picture, but another place where we can figure out history that can help us understand what's going on in a certain place or what's happening is to look at different resources. And so I did that, and I ended up finding a couple that give some pretty good insight into what was going on at Nineveh. The CSB Study Bible was a great one. It said Nineveh was a major city of the Assyrians. Okay, we got that one from our text. A cruel and warlike people who were longtime enemies of Israel. Assyrian artwork emphasized war, including scenes of execution, impalement, flaying of the skin of prisoners, and beheadings. Ugh, these are not good people. The Bible Knowledge Commentary, one of our favorite commentaries around here, says Nineveh was the capital of one of the cruelest, vilest, most powerful, and most idolatrous empires in the world. These were not good people. I can totally see that they would be a hard one to want to go and hang out with.
Oh, yeah. I think for most of us, I mean, I think fear alone would keep me away from going to a people group like that. And we see as we keep reading that wasn't necessarily Jonah's motive, but at this moment, we don't really, we don't know that. But just learning more about Nineveh and the Assyrians gives us some clue, some indicator about why maybe Jonah did flee. Or maybe especially knowing that they were one of the biggest threats to Israel from the north.
Truly. Truly. It makes us actually question our own motives. How often does fear become the thing that makes us want to disobey God? Just because it's so natural for us to be paused in moving forward. God asked Jonah to go do this, and these were his mortal enemies. These were people he absolutely feared, and I can understand the pause for sure.
Absolutely. Good point.
So the other thing that we think about is, who is it written about? And right after our verses in, verses 1-3, we get introduced to a bunch of sailors. Jonah ends up hopping on his boat. He's headed to Tarshish. He's running away from God and fleeing. And the opening verses, he's not only been called to speak to Gentiles or non-Jews in Nineveh, but the irony here is that he hops on this boat to Tarshish and ends up running into, guess what? Gentiles. All of the sailors on there are people that are not Jewish descent. And so he ends up almost preaching to, in a weird way, the message of who God is and the power of who God is indirectly to a group of people he wasn't ever intending. It just cracks me up because he was like, no, I'm not going to go tell the Gentiles. And then he gets on a boat and he's just like, look at that. There's a bunch of Gentiles and they're going to see the power of God standing right here without him even trying. He ends up doing it because the text actually tell us that the sailors were crying out to their own gods. We know that they were Gentiles, that they weren't Christ followers or God followers at that time.
Well, and they're crying out to their own gods because this storm is legit. Like they are afraid for their lives and they are calling out to their gods, which actually would have been very common. It's a very common worldview, a pagan worldview at the time, is that if when misfortune strikes, that some god was angry, and then it was your job to figure out which god was angry and how do you appease them. So you really do see these sailors in this section here in chapter 1 trying to figure out who is to blame for this storm. And then what do they need to do about it? Because they're afraid for their lives. They're throwing cargo overboard, right?
Well, yeah, and then they actually question Jonah, and they turn to him, and they're just like, okay, well, who's your God? And his answer in verse 9 is so descriptive of who God is. Well, I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And what was the sailors' response? It terrified them. The verse actually right after says it terrified them, and they're like, what have you done? Here they knew of all these other gods that they were trying to call on. And as soon as Jonah described who his God was, the one that made the sea, the one that controls the storm that we are on, they knew this meant business. And they were taking Jonah's God a little bit more seriously than I think Jonah even was.
Right. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind when you're studying this first chapter in Jonah, especially verses 4, pretty much through the end of the chapter, is to look at these sailors here. And it's one of our questions under author is to compare and contrast what's being emphasized here by this comparison between Jonah and the sailors, between Jonah's actions and the sailors' actions. And there's a few things that stood out to us as the sailors were crying out to God, their gods, for help. What is Jonah doing? He's asleep. Jonah's asleep. He's not crying out to God, right? And then as the sailors are is in the middle of this storm, this raging storm, right? Jonah's sleeping. He's really not that concerned for anyone else's life or his own, for that matter. But when things shift and they realize that Jonah was to blame for this storm, the sailors could have been just as unconcerned, but they weren't. They actually tried to row back to dry land, and they couldn't get past the storm. So the sailors actually showed way more mercy, I think, for Jonah than Jonah ever did show for them. So that's in some ways here, we're seeing the sailors act the way Jonah should be, including we see that the sailors are calling at the end of the chapter. The sailors are calling out to God and praying to God for them to not be mad at him or so that God would not be mad at the sailors for throwing their prophet overboard. But also then the chapter ends and they're like giving thanks to God for calming the seas. These are things Jonah should have been doing. Jonah should have been praying that God would calm the seas and giving thanks to him for doing so. And he didn't. So there's a lot you can learn, and there's a lot of irony, really, in this chapter comparing Jonah and the sailors.
Truly. I mean, we also see that God really used the sailors to speak to Jonah in a way, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. He did. I mean, back in verse 6, we see the captain says to Jonah, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call your God. Maybe this God will consider us." And the captain is actually calling Jonah out. Hey, go call your God. Maybe he will be the one that will answer us, right? And then you also see the sailors later telling Jonah, who is to blame for this? And what have you done? And what are we supposed to do? I mean, these sailors are actually calling Jonah to action. Absolutely. Which is something that Jonah should have been already doing.
No, absolutely. And Jonah knows the reason for the raging storm. As much as he's not listening to God, nor is he he's not really paying attention. He's kind of disregarding God, and he's taking a nap. He knows exactly what's going on here. And so that's part of the reason why he ends up telling the sailors to throw him overboard. I mean, there are other options, right? He could have said, hey, turn the ship around, or, we maybe could pray to God to ask for the storm to stop, right? But there's this huge indication of where Jonah's heart's at. He'd rather die than give the message to the Ninevites. Like whatever it's going to take to get me out of this, I will do. And so Jonah's cast over the side of the boat into this raging sea, and the sea is calm, which is amazing. And the men on the boat, to your point, Sarah, they feared the Lord. They offered sacrifice to the Lord. They made vows to him. They ended up finding God in this moment, even though Jonah never intended that to be the case. He was not on a mission to save these sailors. He was on a mission to run from God.
Right.
And yet they found God because of how big God is. So even after watching Jonah flee God, it was that great power of God that truly helped witness to these men and brought awe and reverence to who God really was. But God's not finished with his work yet. This is just the beginning. This story of chapter 1, ends with the Lord providing a great fish to swallow Jonah, where he stayed for 3 days and 3 nights. And this is something where we would think that the story would end, but it truly is the beginning of this narrative. We're going to actually pick up in our next episode, starting in verse 17, which is the last verse of chapter 1, because it kind of leaves this cliffhanger where we just see that Jonah gets swallowed by a big fish or a whale, but we don't necessarily know the next point until we get into chapter 2. And so I actually think that that's a great place for us to just leave with this cliffhanger of God's up to something here.
Right. But we can still apply what we've learned in chapter 1. And a lot of what we're applying, actually, we're seeing through Jonah's mistakes.
100%.
Right. There's a lot of mistakes that Jonah is making. And that is common in biblical narrative, right? It is more descriptive than it is prescriptive, meaning it's describing what Jonah actually did, not necessarily what he should be doing or should have been doing. So, I mean, here we have Jonah, right? And he was the Lord's prophet, and he stopped listening to God's voice, and he stopped obeying God's voice. Yeah. And then also he stopped even talking to God. He's not even calling out to God. So even when we try to hide, even when we stop listening or talking to God, God is perfectly capable of getting our attention. And we see that in this story, through this storm, but we also see that in our own lives. I know I have in the circumstances of my life, in the storms of my life. That's often how God gets my attention. And sometimes he uses unlikely people like the sailors in this story, right?
Right.
So as we go to apply this to our life, we pray like, okay, Lord, how do I apply this to my life? I think we can learn a lot from Jonah, as God is, and even the sailors learned a lot from Jonah in this, right?
Lord, I wish it didn't take a storm to sometimes get my attention, but sometimes it does. And so how powerful was it that God's mighty power was shown in that storm in order to be able to bring those sailors to the truth of who he was?
Yeah.
It's remarkable. I wish for my own life that it didn't take those storms to be able to get there, but sometimes it does.
Sometimes it does, right? I find it comforting in this as well. We see God relentlessly pursuing Jonah.
Oh,
right?
truly.
And we see, as you were talking about, Jonah's stubbornness and his pride and his refusal to submit and his refusal to obey. And for me, that is comforting, knowing that God won't give up on me, that God will be relentless in his pursuit of my children, of our loved ones, when we're disobedient, when we're not listening to him. So I actually find this really, really comforting to see God's response to our stupidity.
Yeah, which is a daily thing. So thank you, Lord, for your patience and compassion and love for us. I love this, Sarah, that you're touching on something that's so helpful, is this idea that we not only are learning what not to do with Jonah and some of the lessons we can learn from that. We can learn a lot from the sailors. That's one thing that's so fun about a narrative approach. This prophetic book is unlike any other prophecy book that we talked about that a little bit in our last episode 93 on how to study Jonah. Is that oftentimes when we're studying a prophecy book, we're not going to get to this much of his actions and his stories of what's going on, and yet because of it, we get to learn a lot from the different characters that are in the story. So this has been fun to discover Jonah chapter 1. If you're interested in studying more of this on your own, you need to check out our Bible study. It's available on our website at thecharaproject.com. And if you also want to just learn more on studying the Bible as a whole, we have a ton of website resources that are there for you. You can subscribe to the Chara Project, like and comment this. We'd love to hear from you. And join us as we continue to build confidence in studying the Bible. We look forward to seeing you next time.